is KC Sports Network, proudly presented by Emprise Bank.
Hey, heed all who enter, and beware this podcast. That's right. This is the Paid Podcast on the Kansas City Sports Network. I'm Nick Springer alongside Kevin Flaherty. We're brought to you by Emprise Bank, your partner in all things possible, member FDIC, with a bit of breaking news on this Wednesday as we record here on the KU basketball front. In the middle of the KU offseason, a lot of people wondering if KU might try to add an additional player to the transfer portal with that number of players shrinking in the pool available for KU and what they might try to do. Of course, he had Bill Self's comments previously about I want 8 starters and so on and so forth. So the question's really swirling. And then we got some pretty negative news early in the day today, followed by some positive news to sort of offset that we're going to be breaking down here on today's episode of the Paid Podcast. If you like what you see, or if you like what you hear, if you're listening on our audio-only platforms, be sure to hit the like, subscribe button. If you're watching on YouTube, leave us a comment and subscribe on YouTube as well at KCSN and the letter U. Let us know what your thoughts are on these moves. We're going to be talking about them throughout the show today. We'll start on the negative side, Kevin, which is Elmarko Jackson, who went down at a closed scrimmage yesterday at the Bill Self basketball camp. For those of you who maybe aren't fully aware, Bill Self has an off-season basketball camp usually in the summer every year in June around this time with young kids and whatnot, and it's normally a great experience, and typically they are capped off by closed scrimmages for the official KU players. So typically that is, your first chance to see, in some cases for members of the media and the people there, first chance to see some of the new players for KU, guys like AJ Storr, Rylan Griffin, along with Zeke Mayo, and then the returning players as well, like Hunter Dickinson, DeJuan Harris, KJ Adams, all that. And at the end of this, unfortunately, yesterday on Tuesday, as we record on Wednesday, Elmarko Jackson went down with an injury. And the immediate reaction was that it was sort of downplayed, but then it comes out today on Wednesday that unfortunately his 2024-25 season is over really before he even got started, unfortunately. And this felt like a pretty big blow for KU. I think, regardless of what your thoughts were on Elmarko Jackson and his freshman season in terms of the hype coming in and so on and so forth about what he could be and kind of where things ended up with him, it seemed like all things pointed to him taking a step forward this offseason and possibly going into more of a complementary role coming up this fall and this winter behind Zeke Mayo and DeJuan Harris. But unfortunately, he's not going to get that chance with a torn patellar tendon, I believe is what it was in the release for KU. So, Kevin, just your initial reactions to this and kind of what were your thoughts at that moment when you heard about Elmarko Jackson being out for the season?
Yeah, Elmarko Jackson, obviously a guy that came into the program with a lot of hype and everything else. People were kind of saying before last season, hey, this guy's a potential lottery pick. The year didn't go that way, but at the same time, I do think there were some expectations there because guys tend to get a lot better in their second year in college with the way it is right now, really their second year when they've been at a place for multiple years. And so, from both a high school standpoint, obviously from a transfer standpoint, you saw Kevin McCullough, for instance, last year take a major jump in his second year at Kansas. And I think that was one of the things that a lot of us kind of had circled as an X factor for this year's team, right? It wasn't necessarily that we were sitting here saying, okay, Elmarko Jackson's going to be the lottery pick that some people had him projected as, but just sort of, hey, they're going to break through sort of some of the scar tissue from that freshman year, and he's going to come out on the other side as a better basketball player. You find out a lot in that year, kind of what you can do, what you can't do, what you need to work on. And Kansas's staff is a really good developmental staff. Guys that stay in the program tend to get better. And the buzz on Elmarko Jackson this offseason was really positive, up until that point. And so I think initial reaction to it is just that. It's not necessarily that you're losing somebody where you say, hey, the national championship hinged on this guy. It's not even necessarily that you're losing a guy that you felt was a guaranteed starter. But I do think that a lot of us thought that he had a major role to play on this year's team, especially if he did make those improvements that a lot of people thought that he could make this year.
Yeah, a couple of things. Just kind of extend on that point, like you mentioned. I mean, I've said it time and time again. I've always believed that Bill Self's biggest strength has been developing players, right? Developing guys over time. And that's why I think maybe in this era of the transfer portal, we've seen that take a little bit of a step back. But in this case of Elmarko, you're right. I mean, I had full confidence in this staff, in Bill Self, and in Elmarko Jackson as an individual, as a player, that he was going to take a step forward. And I was feeling pretty confident in that. And on top of that, the fact that he was going to be going into his sophomore season with a lot less pressure on him than into his freshman season, right?
Yeah.
And you never know how guys are going to respond to that type of pressure, right? I mean, with the fact that you have Zeke Mayo and DeJuan Harris to help kind of relieve that pressure off Elmarko Jackson, that maybe would have allowed him to play more freer and play looser and kind of really just kind of play his style of game. So that was my first reaction was, man, this really sucks because this could have been a huge developmental season for Elmarko Jackson in terms of him as a player at Kansas and beyond Kansas, right? I mean,
Sure.
You think about, I'm sure his pro aspirations. So that was a big blow, certainly. And I think the second part of kind of my reaction initially was, man, my first thought, you look back at this last season, this 2023 season for Kansas, and we've talked about it time and time again. The big issue was your lack of depth, right?
Yeah.
And with Elmarko Jackson, you lose LeBaron Philon. Okay, fine. You still have Zeke Mayo and DeJuan Harris and Elmarko Jackson. Well, now you lose Elmarko Jackson and you start to look around and, that guard room looks a little bit more thin and you start to become a little more concerned about that. And so that was kind of my initial reaction, which was, oh boy. I mean, you talk about the issues he faced last season with a lack of depth, the fact that, you had DeJuan Harris playing 35 plus minutes a night, throughout the entire regular season and how that certainly wore on him. And now you start to think, man, is that going to be sort of a 2.0 type situation, sort of a deja vu, if you will. And that's what got me concerned initially about this. And certainly you feel for Elmarko, part of Bill Self's press release stated, how they crushed him. This was a direct quote from the press release. We're all crushed by this. Elmarko's had a terrific spring. He's worked so hard and improved so much. This will be a challenge that he will meet head on and he will return as good as ever. So, and I think that's the thing is Bill Self, I think really was affected by this pretty seriously. I mean, I think this is the type of player where he was probably very excited to see how Elmarko could step forward. And certainly we do hope that he can have a speedy recovery and return as strong as ever. But yeah, my initial reaction is that this was a big blow to your depth. And I think you kind of mentioned it, this is not a situation where Elmarko Jackson's injury is going to say, man, all of a sudden this team can't make a national championship. But that still doesn't take away from, I think, the significance of you're losing a guy who had a chance to really step up and certainly has the talent and also that depth piece at the guard position.
Yeah, it whittles down your margin for error. And, I know you and I talked.
I love that term, margin for error. That was brought up so much last season. Well, the margin for error is as thin as ever. Margin of error. I love that.
And it's funny because you and I talked quite a bit last year about Nick Timberlake being in a spot where he wasn't starting. He was a guy that was kind of off the bench. And one of the things that we talked about is Kansas may need Nick Timberlake to hit shots in order to win an NCAA tournament game. That could come into play. You see that so often. Everybody always circles, this All-American or that guy. A lot of times when people make it deep in the tournament or make those runs, there's a game in there that somebody has that you don't necessarily expect from them, but they have that contest. Timberlake actually, I'm not sure they beat Samford without Timberlake. And obviously at that point, they were so walking wounded that Timberlake was, playing a high number of minutes. But I think it's somewhat similar. It was something there where you could have seen a scenario where, hey, Elmarko Jackson might have 8 points in the Sweet 16 game or something, and that gets you by in a 73-69 type game or whatever else. And so not having that there, it's not like you all of a sudden say, oh my gosh, like they can't win the Big 12, they can't win national. The goals are still there. I do think that Elmarko Jackson had a chance to be maybe one of the more positive X factors on this year's roster in that he could have provided an impact that people maybe weren't counting on as much. When you're doing the math on the chalkboard and saying, okay, 15 points here, 7 rebounds here or whatever, Elmarko Jackson wasn't necessarily a guy that everybody was accounting for. He still has a lot of ability. He's a really good athlete. I think maybe got into his head a little bit last year with the way that things went, didn't seem super comfortable. If he worked through that and was coming out on the other side as it it kind of sounded like it was, you can understand Bill Self kind of being like, well, gosh, this really stinks, because you want a guy to go from that straight into having success and those different things. But yeah, to me, I mean, Elmarko Jackson could have been a major positive on this year's team. And now, the next time we see him play will be in 2026. Oh gosh, that sounds forever and a half from now. Yeah. So
yeah. So that is the bad news. Elmarko Jackson, it's unfortunate given the circumstances of how it happened. Obviously, at what's supposed to be sort of a lighthearted scrimmage, a chance to kind of put on a show for some young campers at the Bill Self camp, it turns into unfortunately season-ending injury, a torn patellar tendon for Elmarko Jackson. So as you said, the recovery period is about 12 months, so he will be out for the entirety of the 2024-25 season for KU. So the good news is he'll have a chance to use this as a redshirt season while he recovers, and I certainly hope him for the most recovery. And like we mentioned, our initial reaction was, hey, there's a little bit of lack of depth. Well, luckily, KU sort of remedied that a little bit in the same time frame. We're going to be talking about that next with the transfer portal edition for Kansas. But first, we're going to take a break. I do want to tell you about our friends at Home Field Apparel. They have some of the best college apparel that you can find anywhere vintage, over 130 different schools. They're adding in some really fun schools this summer. They've got the UC Santa Barbara Banana Slugs, I believe. They're adding in the Fighting Artichokes. They're adding in a couple of other fun schools. So if you like just fun designs, they've got that. And of course, they have Kansas as well, over 40 items for KU. I've got the Kansas track and field relays,
nice
Field Apparel shirt on for today's episode as well. So they've got you covered in Kansas. And if you want to branch out a little bit, have some fun, get some fun different logos, schools, they've got you covered as well. And we have you covered here at on the Pay Podcast with KCSN. With code KCSN, you can get 15% off your first order at homefieldapparel.com. That's code KCSN23. Sorry, KCSN23 is the code. KCSN23 to get 15% off your first order at homefieldapparel.com. We're back talking more KU basketball right after this.
We appreciate you supporting KC Sports Network by listening to our podcast. You have helped us become the highest-ranked Chiefs podcast network in 2022 and 2023. And don't forget about our daily Substack newsletter, the best written analysis you can find on the Chiefs straight to your inbox every day. kcsn.substack.com.
This is the Pay Heat Podcast here on the Kansas City Sports Network. I'm Nick Springer alongside Kevin Flaherty. If you like what you're hearing or what you're watching, if you're watching us on YouTube, be sure to leave us a comment, leave us a review as well. If you're listening on our audio platforms, give us a 5-star rating and review. Spread the word. It helps us expand our podcast here on KCSN. Thanks so much for tuning in. A bit of breaking news. We talked about Elmarko Jackson, unfortunately, his season-ending injury. And that comes out early this afternoon on Wednesday. And within a mere hours, Kansas pivots and kind of helps to try to remedy that loss of Elmarko Jackson for the season by adding a fourth player out of the transfer portal. And that is Shakeel Moore, a guard who started his career at NC State, spent the last 3 seasons at Mississippi State. And he is a grad transfer coming in to join Kansas. He's a 6'1" guard with some athletic pop. So we just talked about sort of the concerns about the depth issues for Kansas with the loss of Elmarko Jackson. Shakeel Moore seems like, sort of a swap in terms of, hey, a guy that can come in with some experience and maybe give you that additional depth at the guard position. What was your reaction, Kevin, to the addition of Shakeel Moore for KU?
Yeah, Shakeel Moore's an interesting one because not only he's a really high-level defender. I think 2 years ago, wasn't it, that he was a Naismith Award finalist, one of the 15 finalists for the Naismith Award, Defensive Player of the Year Award. He's a good defender. He's got clips of him, dunking on guys and stuff like that as a 6'1" guy. So he's got some hops and got some athleticism. He's got kind of a smooth lefty stroke that, he hasn't necessarily shot super well in his career, but did shoot better last year. I think he hit 36+% from 3. But the other thing that I would add to that I think is interesting is with transfers, you try and look at context, right? Like I know Riley Kugel is no longer coming to Kansas, but one of the things that we looked at on this show was that some of his shooting numbers were because of the context in which he was taking those shots. When you look at Shakeel Moore, one of the things that stands out to me is Mississippi State is defense, 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 defense. Oh my gosh, we have to play offense, defense. And so, He's a guy that, has shown some offensive flashes at time, but at the same time, I hesitate to almost like draw a limit on what he can do offensively because Mississippi State's focus is so defensive. They don't run great stuff offensively. They don't necessarily put their guys in the best position to succeed on that end. And Chris Jans, is a tremendous coach. He won just an absolute ton at New Mexico State before heading over to Mississippi State. But defense has always been the emphasis. And so you do have a guy that's a really high-level defender that can come in and give you some relief at that point guard spot. Maybe you could play him next to DeJuan, but you'd be pretty small. I think that's one of the advantages that maybe Elmarko would have had if he were healthy in that spot, is a taller, longer guy who could maybe play alongside DeJuan Harris at times. But at the same time, like I said, I think Shakeel Moore is a guy who might surprise some people offensively just because of the fact that he's operated so far in his career, sort of out of a positive offensive system. And talk about experience. You bring in a guy with 68 starts in his career, 124 games played. He's a guy that checks a lot of boxes for me, Nick.
Yeah, I think even if you just set aside the Elmarko Jackson injury, if you just kind of put that in its own compartment on its own and look at this addition just sort of, in a vacuum in that sense, this makes a lot of sense, even regardless of the Elmarko Jackson injury. Now, when you couple in the Elmarko Jackson injury, all of a sudden it makes a ton of sense. It's a great addition. But even, assuming Elmarko Jackson has stayed healthy, I think Shakeel Moore is the type of player that you would be happy to add if you're Kansas because of some of the reasons that you outlined, Kevin. This is an experienced player, but this is not a guy that's going to be demanding a ton of minutes, right? You look at Mississippi State, in 33 games in this past season, he started 22, averaged just over 23 minutes per game. So not somebody who's necessarily going to be coming in and demanding a ton of minutes. And that's kind of what KU needed because you look around at some of the other talented players they have, and it was going to be very difficult for Kansas to pitch adding a player like a Cohen Hawkins or like somebody like that who is going to be, expecting to play a significant amount of minutes. So I think that made a lot of sense. You mentioned his defense as well, which obviously, ding, 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 that fits the Bill Self mold, obviously. So, that's huge. And but he's also a player that does have that upside athleticism that can, he's got some great highlight dunks. So, he had a big dunk against Kentucky at one point of the season. Yep. I like this ad overall. I think it makes a lot of sense. And I think, again, even if you were to set aside the Elmarko Jackson injury, this is an ad that would make sense because this is a situation where, and you're seeing this around college basketball, Kevin, teams, they want to get older. They want more experienced players. And so if you think about the fact that, okay, you lost LeBaron Philon, but you brought in Shaq Moore, you just outlined it. A guy that's already played over 120 games at the college level, you probably take that in 2024. Maybe 10 years ago, you'd say, well, that's stupid. You obviously want the kid that, the guy that's going to be in your program. Well, newsflash, he may not even be in your program. Obviously, in the case of LeBaron Philon, he may make his campus. So I do like this addition for those different reasons, and I think it makes sense that they would bring him in, especially given the Elmarko Jackson injury. The timing of it is a bit funny, obviously, because you have the Elmarko Jackson news kind of come out, and then within mere hours, Shakeel Moore commits. Who knows about the timing of that? If maybe this is something that was already kind of in the works even before the Jackson injury happened, and then it just kind of ended up being a situation where that news came out. But overall, yeah, this is a player that can hit from three as well, as you mentioned. Not necessarily a volume shooter, but a spot-up guy that can hit occasionally from three. Not much of a pick-and-roll player. I don't think he did the pick-and-roll much at Mississippi State, but he definitely has tremendous upside defensively, obviously, and is a player that I think is a guy that, without knowing him specifically, without knowing sort of his personality, is somebody that can come in and won't be upset about maybe playing less minutes because that's kind of been what he's been already at previous stops.
It's interesting. I'd be interested to hear what you think about how sort of that 1-2 spot works out now, the minutes, because you've got DeJuan Harris, obviously, but now you have Zeke Mayo, who's kind of that combo 1-2, Shakeel Moore, who's more 1 than 2, but, could potentially take some of the. How do you see that kind of shaking out? Because obviously you've got Rylan Griffin in there as well, who's going to want some minutes at that 2 spot. So it becomes kind of an interesting conversation, I think.
Yeah, you kind of mentioned it. I think people may look at Shakeel Moore's size at 6'1", and that may raise some red flags about that. Honestly, Kevin, I'm not really that concerned. I mean, You're going to be rolling out Rylan Griffin, who is 6'5". You're going to be rolling out AJ Storr, who is a lengthy wing. You've got KJ Adams as well, who obviously has some size. So I'm not really that concerned, to be quite honest, about the size situation. I mean, obviously, I don't think it would behoove Kansas to play Moore and Harris next to each other for extended minutes. But I don't know. That doesn't really. I'm not really concerned about that aspect of it that much. And as you mentioned, if there is a situation where you run up against a team where that could become a problem, that the team that maybe has like a bigger two, now you just shift Rylan Griffin over. You shift Rylan Griffin over to play the two, and all of a sudden you got AJ Storr as well still. And Marquise Passmore supposedly was looking pretty good at the scrimmage as well. Now I will say, full pump the brakes on scrimmage talk, okay? Because it's a lighthearted scrimmage. It's not a serious thing. I don't even think they generally don't even like keep actual stats of the game. So
the reporters up in the stands are usually like comparing. Do you have him with 20? I have him with 18. And so it's for those of you who haven't been there, it's really cool, and that it's a first chance to see not just the new guys, but also see how the old guys have come along a little bit. Are they the guy that is missing a jumper? Is he making jumpers now? And so there is some value to it. It's really fun, but like you said, you have to realize it's kind of a late nighty type deal where it's like people aren't really sitting down in the stands and playing defense. I mean, I would say running offense a whole ton, and so. You do have to take these things with a grain of salt a little bit.
I mean, I would say it's almost even lower than a late nighty type thing. I mean, it's I don't know. Yeah, I guess, but yeah, the point being is that Marquise Passmore now seems like a player that could be. I mean, I don't know. I guess with the Elmarko Jackson injury, maybe. Do you think that it increases any chance of Marquise Passmore having a bigger role, or was that kind of independent already of Elmarko Jackson, or? In terms of, I don't know, I guess because if you're going to play Rylan Griffin with the two potentially, maybe that does open up a possibility where you see Marquise Passmore a little more. I don't know.
Yeah, I think you just hit the nail on the head in terms of it probably doesn't affect it a ton, but if Rylan Griffin does move down a little bit, that lineup to the two, play more minutes at the two, that potentially opens up more minutes for Passmore at the three, because I do think with the guys that they have, I'm not seeing a whole lot of minutes for Passmore at the two, as a wing. I think most of his minutes are going to come at the three, where, AJ Storr probably going to start at the three, Rylan Griffin probably going to get minutes at the three. And so if Griffin does shift down it and get more minutes at the two than he was before, that could open up a few more minutes for Passmore at the three, but I don't know that it has a huge impact on that at this point.
Yeah, and you think about Shakeel Moore and kind of where he fits in. Again, I think he kind of slides into basically what Elmarko Jackson probably would have been this year, in the sense of sort of your 1-2 guy that you can use probably to relieve either DeJuan Harris or Zeke Mayo and play either one of those. I mean, I do think it's nice that he has point guard experience, right?
Yeah,
because Elmarko Jackson obviously had point guard experience as well, but so that sort of helps check that box as well with Shakeel Moore. And it's kind of funny, Kevin. Shakeel Moore comes from Mississippi State. Where did Riley Kugel end up? Ended up at Mississippi State. So a little bit of a funny kind of 1-for-1 there, I guess, with Shakeel Moore coming from Mississippi State and Riley Kugel ending up going to Mississippi State. And I talked about this with Riley Kugel after eventually it didn't work out to where he was going to not be coming to KU. And I feel similarly sort of about the situation, which is these are all situations where, the loss of Elmarko Jackson, we've already kind of touched on it, but maybe didn't necessarily affect the floor of this team, but possibly impacted the ceiling a little bit.
Sure.
And that's maybe how I feel Shakeel Moore as well, where probably it is not going to impact the floor. I think the floor obviously is already pretty high, top 5 team probably. But the ceiling a little bit, in terms of with KU basketball, a ceiling of second weekend versus national title, that makes a big difference to KU fans, right? And so that's where it becomes a little bit more difficult maybe to kind of parse out, okay, well, how much could the ceiling of Elmarko Jackson impacted that how much could the ceiling of a Shakeel Moore impact that? But overall, I do think with this addition, Kansas is still in a pretty decent spot. The interesting thing is, with Elmarko Jackson now and with Shakeel Moore coming in, that gives Kansas 12 scholarship players. I'd see some people asking about Elmarko Jackson in terms of, does the scholarship still count? Yes. The scholarship still counts. Yes. So you're up to 12 now. So now you're kind of back to that same debate we were having previously about this idea of, okay, now you're at 12. Do you go for a 13th? I would think, I don't know. I'm curious about your opinion on this because, you had Shakeel Moore obviously, but with Elmarko Jackson now being out for the year, I would think a 13th scholarship player's probably got to be on the table if you're Kansas to make sure that you do have enough depth. I mean, I'm still flashing back to Bill Self talking about, how much he wanted to add more depth to this team after last season. I don't know. Do you think KU might be done here with the Shakeel Moore, or do you think they might be still looking to maybe add another guard? I mean, we talked a lot about sort of DeJuan Harrison and Zeke Mayo, and now you added Shakeel Moore, but they don't really have much else besides that. I mean, could you possibly even go out and add another guard or something like that?
I think if they added anybody, it would be a wing and maybe even a big wing that could go 3-4, and so I think it's one of those things. I think we've talked about this before. You don't want to leave any bullets in the gun, right? Like if you feel like you're going to compete for the national title, and this is like more true now than it was 5 years ago with the explosion of the transfer portal, you take your shot. And so if there's somebody out there that you feel like, okay, this person can help us even in a depth standpoint or whatever, I think you make that move because you don't know what your roster is going to look like next year. Technically, AJ Storr could come back next year. Different guys could come back that maybe you aren't even, if Griffin and Storr come back next year, maybe KU winds up looking pretty good again next year, but you can't count on any of that, right? You can count on what you have for this year. And so that's what makes me think, hey, go out and get another guy if the right guy is out there. I'm not saying just grab a body for the heck of it, but for me, you were talking about the guard position. What happens if KJ Adams has an injury, at that 4 spot? I think that starts to get really interesting at that point because then you're probably looking at sliding Storr to the 4, but then who else? And so there are still some spots that I'm not saying, obviously if you're talking about depth, then, what will you do if this guy gets injured or whatever? That's a good spot to be in. That's a better spot than 98% of college basketball America right now. But at the same time, when you're looking at that last scholarship, I think that's kind of the way that you need to look at it as sort of a break glass in case of emergency. Okay, what's the emergency that would make us need to break that glass? And I think at this point, it would be either an injury to KJ Adams or an injury to AJ Storr, where all of a sudden, your big wing type guys, you're maybe down a little bit from where you were.
I will say this though, it is somewhat difficult to imagine KJ Adams getting hurt because that dude he is a tank. I mean, yeah. When you look at the definition of tank in the dictionary, it's a picture of KJ Adams. That dude he's incredible in terms of his athletic physique and so on and so forth. So it's hard to envision that. But yeah, I mean, to your point, it's a great point because I think if you were to look at that big wing position, 3-4, and if it was a Storr or an Adams that suffers an injury, I think at that point it also kind of hinges on what's your confidence level in Zach Clemens. I mean,
sure.
If he's a guy that you think could legit, step in and play a little bit at the 4 position, I think that would be probably the answer in terms of guys that are on the roster right now. But if your confidence level in that is not very high, then yes, you do have concerns because Flory, even though he's 6'7", measured in shoes, he is unequivocally, I think, a 5. I don't think.
For sure.
Yeah. I don't think you can play him, next to Hunter at the same time. So that is a kind of an interesting question. And you think about some of the bad luck that Kansas has had over the past couple of years with this type of stuff. Obviously, the Bill Self health scare that kind of derailed the end of the 2022 season and the 2022 tournament. And then this past season, you had one of the best starting 5s in the country, but couldn't stay healthy with Kevin McCauley getting hurt. And now, again, the Elmarko Jackson injury, which again, maybe it doesn't necessarily impact the floor of Kansas, but probably certainly negatively impacts the ceiling a little bit. And you bring in Shakeel Moore to kind of hopefully offset that a little bit. But yeah, I don't know. At this stage, I think it's. I'll be curious to see what KU does next. And Bill Self is the only guy, I guess, at this point that maybe kind of has a general feel of what they might be doing.
Yeah, it's a good problem to have, but I would also remind people, not that KU was as deep last year, but at this point last year, we felt really positively. I mean, you still had,
at this point last year, I was saying
you still had Arterio Morris, you had, you had all this stuff, and so you do, and I should probably knock on about 8 different kinds of wood before saying this. You do need to prepare in case of disaster, because last year disaster happened, right? They came out of, playing their summer stuff, and Bill Self saying, "Oh my gosh, we're so athletic, look at how good we look," to, okay, Arterio's never going to suit up, Kevin McCullough's going to have an injury, Nick Timberlake's not going to shoot the way you think he's going to, Elmarko Jackson, who multiple people projected as a lottery pick, is not going to have that kind of a season. That's like 4 or 5 catastrophic events that all happened. And that's not even counting the fact that I think that, Hunter Dickinson was banged up late in the year. You add in some of these other things, but that's like 4 catastrophic things that happened from like August on or so. And so you do kind of need to prepare a little bit just in case. And so, it's, Bill Self, as we've said on this show before, is as good as anybody, if not better than anybody, at kind of adjusting to things that went wrong in the past and say, that's not going to happen to me again. And so I think because of the way things went last year, I do think it would make a lot of sense for Kansas to use that 13th scholarship to try and bring in another guy just in case.
Kevin, I mean, at this point last season, I was thinking 40-0.
I'm just they looked unbelievable, and you look back and say, a healthy, not in trouble Arterio Morris, a healthy Kevin McCullough, and last year's team looks a lot different in March and could have potentially competed for a national title. Certainly would have had a better seed going in, where you're not drawing UConn in the Sweet 16 as they would have if they had gotten by Gonzaga. But there's a reason these coaches get paid the big bucks. They have to wrestle with all this stuff, and then you and I go and talk about it.
Yeah, I mean, some of the solace for me from last season was the fact that, I mean, good Lord, you watch UConn and just think there's just no way anybody is going to beat them. Yeah. So, even with kind of the way last season ended, that was kind of my thought as I kind of watched the rest of March Madness unfold. It's just, I mean, gee, why are we even playing these games? It's going to be UConn. I mean, it was just, yeah. So I kind of take some solace in that, I guess, from last season. But yeah, no, great point to this season is that I'm sure Bill Self, took all that in and thought, yeah, this sucks. Let's make sure this doesn't happen again in terms of the injuries and so on and so forth. And so it is a real bummer that Elmarko Jackson went down, because I think, he's a guy that a lot of the fan base probably last year ragged on unfairly for some of his performances just because of the expectations for him coming into the season. And I think he had a real legit chance to be a player that could step up and make some big plays for KU this season and more of a complementary role where the pressure isn't on him so much. So it's really unfortunate, and I hope the fan base will rally around him and hopefully, cheer him on in his recovery. You add Shaq Moore to sort of help reinforce the guard position, and we'll see if KU is done or not in that area. So this is a fun little breaking news pod with the Elmarko injury plus the commitment of Shaq Moore. This is the Pay Heat Podcast. I'm Nick Springer alongside Kevin Flaherty. That's it for us on this edition of Pay Heat. But keep an eye out on your feeds later this week for the continuing of our series of the Jayhawk Rewind. We're going to be talking about a game that was maybe not so fun for KU football as we get closer to the start of the 2024 season of football, but maybe some lessons from that game that KU can take going into 2024 as well. So stay tuned on your KCSN feeds, whether you're listening on audio or watching us on YouTube, for more content here from the Pay Heat Podcast. covering all things KU. Until then, he's Kevin Flaherty. I'm Nick Springer. Thanks for listening to another episode of Pay Heed. We'll talk to you later. See ya.